I think this is the story of one of the greatest bands ever. Definitely the story of, maybe my favorite band ever. Welcome to Lancaster Hi-Fi. I'm Stephen Lancaster, and today I want to talk about one of my favorite bands of all time, and who I think is one of the greatest bands of all time, Gentle Giant. I started listening to Gentle Giant when I was very young, probably 1975, when I was 8. And that's because that's when my oldest brother started listening to Gentle Giant, somewhere around then. So it could have been 74, 75, somewhere in there. He was then a senior in high school, and my next older brother would have been a sophomore in high school, and also got into Gentle Giant. And so they played it on the family stereo, and I listened to it. And my favorite song was a Gentle Giant song. I didn't know that it was a Gentle Giant song until I started buying records, say 5, 6 years later when I was about 14. And one of the first albums I ever bought, not the first, but among the first handful, an early handful, was Freehand by Gentle Giant. And I'll talk about that because I'm just going to go through their records and talk about their story. I think it's an interesting story. I think it's a somewhat inspiring story. And it's also part of the story of how I got into music. So let's talk about Gentle Giant. When we're talking about Gentle Giant, we're talking about, at its core, originally, were 3 brothers. The oldest, Phil Shulman, Ray Shulman, and Derek Shulman. In the late 60s, mid to late 60s, they started a band called Simon Dupree and the Big Sound, where Derek Shulman was the frontman and he was Simon Dupree. And they started off as like a blues rock band and then kind of transformed into a psychedelic band when psychedelic rock became a big thing in England. That transformation got them a hit or two, but it also kind of sapped their credibility a bit from some of the hardcore rock fans in England because they were seen to have sold out. And I suppose that's a legitimate complaint, that they kind of sold out by going psychedelic. So they got kind of put through that mid to late 60s rock music business meat grinder, which, probably wasn't a very savory thing. Say around, in the very late 60s, 69, 70, they formed a new band. And it was called Gentle Giant. And they developed a whole story of Gentle Giant. This is their first album, Gentle Giant. And here we have the giant holding the band. And inside we have the story of the Gentle Giant and the lyrics. This is their first album. Definitely not the first album I bought. I only found this later. This one's hard to find in the US, particularly hard to find in the US. So I got this one in Germany in like 1983. But let's get back to sort of the story of this band. They, having gone through what they went through as Simon Dupree and the Big Sound, they were much more intentional about this new band. So they got a blues rock guitarist, Gary Green. They got an amazing keyboardist and singer, Kerry Manier. And they got a drummer, Martin Smith. And I don't know much about Martin Smith. He was on the first 2 albums, but not part of the more long-term lineup. So the point of them starting this new band was to play the music that they wanted to play. So they, having learned their lessons, they actually managed to do what they wanted to do and make a decent living at it. They were never huge stars. They kind of tried in the later 70s to kind of transition away from prog into more popular genres. That transition wasn't particularly successful. I think they became discouraged with what might be necessary, and then I don't know. It's a little fuzzy to me exactly what led to their breakup, but my impression is that they just became discouraged, and their efforts to become or maintain popularity had been unsuccessful. And they produced a couple of mediocre albums and one pretty bad album towards the end, and broke up. But before that, they came out with a series of like 6 or 7 great albums in a row. One of the ways that you can decide, who's a great rock band is how many great albums in a row were they able to release. And you can say, okay, Metallica, maybe their first album not great, I don't know, but, second, third, fourth, maybe, so they came out with maybe 4 great albums in a row, depending on whether you count the Black Album or Kill 'Em All, right? The Rolling Stones came out with a number of great albums in a row. And I'm not going to try to bang them off, but, including Sticky Fingers, Beggar's Banquet, etc. The Beatles came out with a number of great albums in a row. In fact, arguably all the Beatles albums from Rubber Soul on and maybe Hard Day's Night on were great albums. But then you go like, okay, well, let's look at some great prog bands. King Crimson, how many great albums in a row did they come up with? Arguably the last 3 in the 70s were great, although Starless and Bible Black, not my favorite. Arguably the 3 in the 80s were great, I think, but I don't think those 80s albums are quite up to the level of, say, Red. We could argue this point, but Red is among, I'd say, the greatest prog albums of all time. But early on, their first album, great album, but after that, kind of went through a series of albums that weren't so great. What about Yes? Well, okay, we've got the Yes album, Fragile, Close to the Edge, Tales from Topographic Oceans. I don't know. That doesn't fire on all cylinders for me. Relayer after that, it's a pretty good album. It's a good album. I'd say it's a great album. But, you've got, okay, depending on whether you count Tales from Topographic Oceans, we've got 5 albums that are great there. But I'd say you kind of gotta ding them for Tales from Topographic Oceans. It has great moments, but there's a reason Rick Wakeman left after that album. Pink Floyd. Does Metal count? I think Metal's a great album, although, some people would say just putting Seamus on there means that's not a great album. But I like that song, and I'd call Metal a great album. What about the album before that? What about Atom Heart Mother? Or, well, did that come out? Or was it Obscured by Clouds that came out right before Metal? I think it was Obscured by Clouds. So that's not really a great album. And Atom Heart Mother, I think it's a great album, but I don't, it's kind of, it's a quirky album. So let's say Metal, Dark Side of the Moon, Wish You Were Here, Animals. I think those are Metal. Yeah, I think those are 4 great albums in a row. And I think most people would say The Wall. I'm not super fond of The Wall. It's not, I'd actually put The Wall below Atom Heart Mother. So, yeah, I'd say Pink Floyd had 4 solid great albums in a row. But, they weren't Fast and Furious, 2 years between each of the last 3 there. And Pink Floyd, maybe my favorite band of all time, but these days I think I'd put Gentle Giant above them. Gentle Giant, and I'll go through all these, but Gentle Giant, good album, but not great. Acquiring the Taste, great album. Three Friends, great album. Octopus, great album. I think maybe the best prog album ever. In a Glass House, great album. Power and the Glory, great album. Freehand, great album. So we've got 6. I don't think you can argue with those 6 being great albums. Not a weak song on the lot. And then Interview, which arguably is a great album, but, does kind of slack off in energy, but still has one of their greatest songs on it. So let's subtract Interview. We'll say, okay, not necessarily a great album, but arguable. I'd put it in that sort of, people would argue whether the Black Album by Metallica is a great album. I think it's a great album, but some Metallica fans would say it's not. Okay? Interview is in there. And so, but for sure, 6 great albums in a row in the space of like 5 years. And most of those albums were self-produced. Right? We're not talking about Steely Dan going out and getting like the best, sound engineer, the best mixing engineer, the best producer, the best drummer ever, and, and the best session musicians, and putting out a couple of great albums. No, we're talking about these guys doing it almost all themselves. After acquiring the Taste, all their albums were self-produced. Kind of wow. I mean, dang. So, let's go through the albums and tell this story. So, again, this is their first album, Gentle Giant. It's got some neat songs on it. I think Funny Ways is a great song. Isn't It Quiet and Cold is a great song. Isn't it quiet and cold? Nothing at All is a great song. Why Not? It's kind of cool. Giant, Alucard, I don't know. And they end it with The Queen, which is kind of hokey, but that's cool. So it's a good album. It's a really good album. I don't listen to it that much, kind of because the others are so much better. Even though this is, if they had never gotten better than this, they would be recognized as one of the solid, great progressive rock bands. If all of their albums had been this good and not better, they would have a place in prog history as, as one of the bands that defined what prog was. Because this album, despite it being relatively weak compared to the rest of their catalog in the 70s, was, I think, better than most other prog bands' first and second albums. Let's go through them. ELP. Actually, their first album, pretty great. King Crimson. Okay, yeah. Their first album, one of the greatest prog albums ever. Okay, so, yeah. This is not better than In the Court of the Crimson King. But Genesis, their first couple albums, not so good. I don't even necessarily, I think their first album is called Genesis. I think I've listened to it once, and think the second album I've listened to once, and I can't even remember what it's called, because it's just not that great. And they put out some great albums in the mid-70s, but their first couple were not so awesome. Yes, their first album, yes, it's neat, but it's not great. The second album, Time and a Word, it's all right. It's neat. You see them finding their sound, but it's not a great album. No way. Now with Yes, they don't start producing great albums till their third album, and then they are really great. Arguably the greatest. Who else? I don't know. But you get my point, that they started off with, I think this album is much stronger than Yes, much stronger than Genesis, but I'd put it, I'd say like for first prog albums, I'd put In the Court of the Crimson King, and then Emerson, Lake and Palmer's first album. This is just called Emerson, Lake and Palmer. Can't remember. And then I'd put this a bit below that. But definitely above Yes, definitely above Genesis. Who am I forgetting? Horselips? I don't know when their first album came out. I don't even know it. So let's put it above that as well. Jethro Tull? I'm not as familiar with Jethro Tull's catalog. I was into Jethro Tull pretty early on, but then kind of not. So good album. Really good start. Helped define what it is. I got this copy, and I finally found where the price tag is in 19 Deutschmarks and 90 Pfennigs. And I can't remember whether I got this in Berlin or Bonn in 1983 in the summer. All right. On to the second album, Acquiring the Taste. This is a great album. The cover, rather questionable in its taste. Acquiring the Taste. Huh. Here we have a nice picture of the band. And Derek Schulman. Yeah, I think I can recognize him upside down. Derek Schulman, Gary Green, Martin Smith, Ray Schulman, Kerry Manier, and Phil Schulman. This is a great album. It's kind of dark. It's heavy. This is a heavy album. Maybe their heaviest, looking back on it. I mean, it's not heavy from beginning to end. In fact, Pantagruel's Nativity, not a heavy song as I recall. The House, the Street, the Room, friggin' heavy. Wreck, Black Cat, Plain Truth. Those are all pretty heavy songs. Now, the first album and this album are produced by Tony Visconti. I don't know anything about Tony Visconti, but he was the producer of the first two Gentle Giant albums, and he actually plays recorder on this one. Great album, not a weak track on it. This is back when they were on the Vertigo label, and I think this is my only Gentle Giant album that has that Vertigo label like that. Who else was on Vertigo? Black Sabbath was on Vertigo. In the early days of Sabbath and Gentle Giant, they had the same management and the same label. And they toured together. I couldn't tell you exactly what year or years, whether there was more than one tour. I don't think touring with Sabbath was particularly successful for Gentle Giant, even though Gentle Giant of this era was significantly, heavier. Just Sabbath fans and Giant fans weren't the same people. But I don't think it was an awful experience. I think it just wasn't optimal. I think, and Gentle Giant often wasn't the headliner, so they would tour with Tull and maybe Yes, ELP, I think. But there's a bit of an interesting story around the common management that they had with Black Sabbath. And I don't know the whole story. I know the Gentle Giant side of the story, but if you're familiar with Black Sabbath and their history, you might know that they had significant issues and legal battles with their first management. And it was Gentle Giant that first figured out how crooked that management team was and alerted Black Sabbath, include the men, and explained to them how they were getting robbed by their management. And so if you've heard of how Black Sabbath got out from under the thumb of their early management, that was thanks to Gentle Giant. Who had a lot more experience in the music industry at the time than Black Sabbath did. Black Sabbath, when they started, they were new to the music industry. Gentle Giant was not. I don't recall when exactly I bought this. I think it was relatively late. Finding Gentle Giant albums, not, I challenge you. Go to a record store today, your local record store. Do they have any Gentle Giant albums? Probably not. So I don't recall exactly when I got this. I might not have gotten this until college when I wasn't particularly into prog at that time. So it's taken me a bit longer to get into this album, but this has some great songs on it. It's a great album. Now, if some people would say Acquiring the Taste isn't a truly awesome, upper tier, great album, Three Friends definitely is. But I think I might actually prefer Acquiring the Taste to Three Friends, although Three Friends has one of the greatest heavy Gentle Giant songs on it, Peel the Paint. Peel the paint, look underneath, you'll see the same. Anyway, this is a concept album. My copy of it turns out to also contain their first album. If I had known that at the time, and this I also bought in Germany, 24.90 Deutschmarks. If I had realized that this double album package contained their first album, then I probably wouldn't have bought a separate copy of their first album, and I would have bought In a Glass House when I saw it, whereas I didn't buy In a Glass House until much later. I'll get there. All right. This is a concept album. The concept being there are three friends who were friends in elementary school and what became of them later on. And so it has an interesting variety of styles and sort of draws on those styles to portray these three friends at different points in their lives and different of the three friends. It's kind of an interesting concept because I think we can all relate to that, that you're thrown into elementary school. The people you were friends with there may have had very different lives after that, and especially, I think, maybe even more so in the UK, where students are put into very different tracks relatively early on in high school, whereas in the US, maybe not so much. Neat album, and mine's kind of falling apart. I need to glue this. When I bought this, I was a little less into Gentle Giant at the time, but let's keep track of the years, though. The first one comes out in 1970, Acquiring the Taste. The second one comes out in 1971. Three Friends comes out in 1972. So we're on a pace of at least an album a year. This was their first self-produced album, produced by Gentle Giant. And they also got a new drummer, Malcolm Mortimer. And it would appear that one of their kids, I'm going to just guess that Phil Shulman being the oldest, maybe his son Calvin is the boy's voice on School Days on this album. Prologue, School Days, Working All Day, Peel the Paint, Mr. Class and Quality, Three Friends. My favorite song on here is Peel the Paint. It's the hardest rock song on here. I think most people would say this is a truly great album, and some people would say this is the best Gentle Giant album. I don't think so, but arguably. And again, I got this in Germany in 1983, kind of when I was past my peak being into Gentle Giant. So, fourth album, Octopus. Their third great album in a row. This one came out also in 1972. Again, self-produced. And this one, this is the first one with John Weathers on drums, who was their drummer until the end. This is an amazing album. Not a bad song, not even a weak song on it. And for me, this was kind of a revelation because I had heard excerpts from this album on their live album, which I'll get to, which came out much later. but this one has a lot of Kerry Minnear on it. And Kerry Minnear didn't sing live. He couldn't sing live, but I'll get there. So Oct Opus, 8 songs, really great album. This is a 1980s reissue. You can tell because the sleeve isn't cut out in the shape of the jar, and it's the US jar, Octopus in a Jar version rather than the UK, arguably better cover by, Roger, I don't remember. The UK cover is probably better, but this one I think is pretty neat, especially the original with the cutout jar. It was pretty cool. But when I heard this, just like, oh, this one blew me away. And what's kind of interesting in a way is that this doesn't have much of their heavier sound on it. No The House, the Street, the House, the Room, no Peel the Paint. We get Knots on here, which is an exceptionally complicated arrangement. On this album, you get into that OMG, what is this stuff? How do I even classify this music? It's challenging. But this is what they wanted to do. Now, this would have also been a bit of a tumultuous time for them because this is the last album that Phil Shulman was on. And so in the process, somewhere in there, Phil Shulman left the band before the next album. So I think them looking back on this time, it's hard for them to see this as their greatest album because interpersonally it was a difficult time. But truly wonderful, amazing album. And so this would have been in the period of all the songs were attributed to Shulman, and Minnear. Okay, interesting. Usually the Shulmans came first. In this case, all titles composed by Minnear, Shulman, and Shulman. I think that's about right. Kerry Minnear was the keyboardist, but also the vocalist. He didn't sing live because his voice was relatively weak. But he had a wonderful angelic voice, and it figures prominently on this album. They're coming over Chariton Bridge. Which is why they never why in their live show they didn't perform a full song from this album. Yeah, amazing album. Okay, their 5th album, In a Glass House. I only bought this a couple years ago, and I bought it the second time I ever saw it in a record store. This album was not released in the US. Not for any legal, weird reason, simply that the record company, the US record company, thought it was awful and didn't want to release it. It went on to become one of the biggest selling import albums of all time because they did have a pretty loyal following in the US who wanted this album despite it not being released. So every copy that you see in the US is an import, including this one, printed and made in England. So this album was not released in the US because the label in the US decided it was crap. And which I can actually sympathize with on some level. If you had some label exec who heard this album who wasn't familiar with prog in general and Gentle Giant specifically, they'd listen to this and go, this is crap. This, one of their great albums, some people would say their greatest album, is difficult. Once I was a boy, an innocent life in my own, and if this world It's cool. It's got this double negative overlaying cover. So I saw this in Germany and didn't buy it because I got what else did I buy? I bought Gentle Giant's first album. I bought Three Friends, not knowing that that copy of Three Friends also had their first album in it. Had I known, I would have left behind the first one and bought this instead. What else did I buy? I bought Red. I bought Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. I mean, it's not like I didn't come home with some great albums from Germany. Unfortunately, I didn't get this one, and I only saw it again in a record store here in Corvallis, Oregon, a couple of years ago and bought it. So I'm less familiar with this album than pretty much all of the others, and it's not my favorite. But some people think this is their greatest album, and this is the first one without Phil Shulman on it. So the lineup here, we've got Derek Shulman, Gary Green, Kerry Minnear, Ray Shulman, John Weathers. And this is the lineup that would take them through to the end. We have the pictures of the band on the back. And what we see is that, they were all multi-instrumentalists. You know, at core, they could be, lead vocalist, guitar, bass, drums, keyboards. But then they might all break out into second instruments. A couple of them would pick up recorders. Ray would pick up a violin, maybe a cello. I think Kerry would stay on keyboards, maybe, but he might pick up a recorder. And John Weathers, of course, would stay on the drums. So I just want to read off the credits here. So Derek Shulman, vocals, alto and soprano sax, and recorder. Gary Green, 6 and 12 string guitars, mandolin, percussion, and alto recorder. Kerry Minnear, all keyboards, tune percussion, recorder, and vocals. Ray Shulman, bass guitar, violin, acoustic guitar, percussion, and backing vocals. John Weathers, drums and percussion. So yeah, they would all break out into these second and third instruments, including lead singer Derek Shulman. He'd pick up a saxophone. So you might imagine after the fiasco of not getting released in the U.S., which was where maybe most of their fans were. Okay, so let's backtrack to something I mentioned earlier, that they were not as popular in the UK as you might expect a UK band to be, because they had, when they were Simon Dupree and the Big Sound, people thought they sold out when they went psychedelic. And that can happen with a band, right? Especially in England. And who does the lead singer of The Cure hate the most? The old Cure fans who hate him because he sold out. So UK fans have a reputation for being somewhat vindictive. So their biggest markets, I think, were West Germany at the time and the US, which is why I was able to find their albums in West Germany and the US. Had a bit of a hard time finding some of them in the US, and that includes this one. But they changed labels after this. And I think now we get into where they really hit their stride with The Power and the Glory. Okay, so where are we at? We're at their 6th album and their 5th great album. And this one really, if I think there are some weak points on In a Glass House, there are no weak points on this album. And again, we have one of the most complicated arrangements of any Gentle Giant song in Cogs and Cogs. This is, again, one of those albums, people hear it and they go, what the hell is that? Members of my own family hear Gentle Giant, and especially this album, and go, what the hell is that? They had become really, truly masterful. They had developed a sound that really, I think, crystallizes on this album, and that they carry into the next album and the one after that. Power and the Glory, I think, I've read at least, referring in part to the power exercised by record companies and indicating their, this is in some senses a concept album in that it begins and ends with proclamation and valedictory, which are essentially sung from the first person of a monarch, an absolute monarch. Oh, where were we in years? Keep forgetting to keep that up. So, Octopus had come out in 1972, and then In a Glass House comes out in, I believe, 73. So in 72, they had 2 albums, Three Friends and Octopus, and then this comes out in 1973. Yeah, okay, recorded July 73. Again, produced by Gentle Giant. Then Power and the Glory came out in 1974. So this one, 1974, and new record label, new U.S. label, Capitol, EMI. Yeah, amazing album. Proclamation, So Sincere, Aspirations, Playing the Game, Cogs and Cogs, No God's a Man, The Face, Valedictory, all really strong. Again, the usual lineup of Shulman, Minnear, Green, Weathers. Album produced and arranged by Gentle Giant for Alucard Productions Limited. Recorded at Advision Studios, London, December 73 through January 74. All titles composed by Shulman, and Minnear. Right. And I think that's the same as on In a Glass House. Whereas they were, Minnear was first credit on Octopus. On this one, Shulman, and Minnear. Yeah, great album. There was a really great video, I think, released on Instagram, mainly a fan video, but at the time of the lockdown, the COVID lockdown, of people singing Proclamation. And if you haven't seen that, I get a little choked up even remembering it. It's a moving video, and I suggest you check it out if you haven't.
The situation we are in at this time, neither a good one, nor is it so unblessed. It can change, it can stay the same. I can say, I can make my claim.
Great album. And then their 7th album in 1975, I believe. 1975, yeah. Capitol Records again. We get Freehand. This one came from a radio station, KISR, Kisser. And it has written on the back, night only. No daytime radio play, no primetime radio play for this. Definitely not on the drive-in. Definitely not lunch hour. Only at night. Man, my brother would tell me how there were, 4 new copies of this that made it to Fayetteville, Arkansas, and of course he knew everyone who had one. I found this used in Fayetteville, discarded from a radio station, and it is a cutout, remainder bin, or promotional, I suppose. Again, we've got Shulman, Minnear, Green, and Weathers, Gentle Giant production, and all selections composed by Ray Shulman, Derek Shulman, and Carrie Minnear. So now they're specific about which Shulman comes first. Interesting, though, because, Ray could be lost in the background because he doesn't sing any of the songs. And although I think almost all of them sing on Reflection. You still you stay, time make your way. No instrument credits on this one. I think they just all play friggin' everything. This is the only Gentle Giant album I've replaced. This copy is so worn out. This was the first Gentle Giant album I bought, and among the first albums I ever bought when I was in 8th grade. And, immediately one of my favorite albums, because, again, this was the album that had just come out or came out when my brothers were first into Gentle Giant in 1975. Or I don't remember whether my oldest brother discovered them in 74 or 75, but, this came out and they played it a lot. And I loved this album when I was a little kid. Didn't know it, but when I bought it, when I was 14 and not 8, I was like, oh, wow, I love this album. Now I remember this. I love this album. And I played it a lot on my cheap all-in-one stereo record player. And it was probably pretty raggedy at the time, having been at a radio station. So I was listening to this one day recently, and I was just like, dog, come on, replace this album already. If you've been wanting to get into one of the new remixes, re-releases, re-engineered or whatever, get this one. So I got the CD of Freehand. Yeah, so I got it over there, but I played this album a lot. I also actually had a concert t-shirt from the tour for this album, with the giant hand coming up, just said Gentle Giant, and wore that t-shirt out in high school. Because it was just a friggin' hard rock t-shirt, man. The t-shirt had a glove with like a studded bracelet on it, It was friggin' awesome, friggin' epic. This album has a bit of their hard sound, but really carries on with the sound that crystallized on Power and the Glory. Not to say that this is coasting by any means. This is, again, one of those albums people hear and they go, what the hell is that? In fact, my friend Chris, I played the CD of this for him, and he's like, what the hell is that? Is this like Christmas music or something? No, this is prog, and this is the PSVANE's prog album. I say Octopus is my favorite Gentle Giant album, and maybe my favorite prog album, but maybe it's this one, because this is the first one. This is the one I played to death. Yeah, it's a great album, and the first 2 songs just the same, and On Reflection, very different songs, but very representative of Gentle Giant's sound. Not a weak song on it, though. Okay, last arguably great album, Interview, which came out in 1976. I don't know if I would include this in their great albums. Let's just say, let's have a very high bar for great albums and say this is not one of their great albums. But I think it probably really is. It's just, it seems a little lower energy than the 2 previous, but does continue some of that sound and actually picks up, with probably the hardest track of theirs since probably Peel the Paint. And they, in fact, did a medley of this when they toured for this album. They did a medley of I Lost My Head and Peel the Paint. Super hard, and I think that song was probably my favorite song when this album came out, because when this came out, my oldest brother had already gone to college, but my next older brother was still in town, and obviously would have had this album because he was a huge Gentle Giant fan. And so, yeah, I Lost My Head was one of those songs that has been with me since this album came out in 1976, and I was 9. Again, I managed to find a remainder bin used copy of it. I'm looking to see if this might have been, it's got somebody's name on here. So we have a picture of the band. See if I can figure out who's who in this. So that's Ray for sure. John Weathers, the glasses, Gary Green. I'm not sure. Kerry Minnear and Derek Shulman both had beards and mustaches. That's probably Derek. That's probably Kerry. All compositions, Shulman, and Minnear, and all permutations thereof. a Gentle Giant production, recorded at Advision Studios, London, February, March 1976. After which they pretty much immediately went on tour. Cool pictures of the band on here. John Weathers, Derek Shulman, Ray Shulman, and we've got credits. John Weathers drums, Derek Shulman vocals, saxes, Ray Shulman bass, violin, Gary Green guitars, Kerry Minier keyboards. So interesting that we don't have recorders on this one. We don't have Gary Green and Ray Shulman playing recorder, for example. So you can argue that they kind of toned things down on this album in terms of the complicated arrangements and the madrigal kind of recorder trios and whatnot. So you could sort of see this as the beginning of something that didn't go anywhere good, but they thought was a good idea at the time. And this is a really good album. I don't think I would include this among their great albums, but this one, their eighth album in, from 1970 to 1976. Which brings us to the live album, the official live Gentle Giant playing the Fool. And I think the reason it says the official live Gentle Giant is because this had been, or some version of this had previously serviced under the same title, Playing the Fool, as a bootleg. So they said, well, never mind that. I mean, if people are going to buy the bootleg, they'll buy the official version. Let's make a good live album. And they did. And this might have been the second or third Gentle Giant album that I got. I know I got Freehand first, maybe Interview after that, but maybe this one. So a lot of what I early on learned of their catalog came from this album. And that's kind of interesting because I mentioned earlier that Kerry Minier did not sing live. Here we have them live, and we have their... I love this map of the tour. So we can see where they played the most. Of course, they played a lot of dates in the UK, but they played a lot in Germany and a lot in the US. Playing the Fool, a Gentle Giant production, recorded Au Naturel on European tour September to October 1976. Remix at Advision Studios, London. Let's look at the instrument and vocal credits. So Derek Shulman, vocals, alto sax, descant recorder, bass and percussion. Ray Shulman, bass, violin, acoustic guitar, descant recorder, trumpet, vocals and percussion. Kerry Minier, all keyboards, cello, vibes, tenor, recorder, vocals and percussion. Gary Green, electric, acoustic, and 12-string guitars, alto and descant recorders, vocals and percussion. John Weathers, drums, vibes, tambour, vocals and percussion. So you can see how they would all pitch in to play all their tunes live. But they had to rearrange everything. For a band that had such complicated arrangements in the studio, playing live was a challenge. And moreover, their second lead vocalist, Kerry Minier, couldn't really lead vocal live. And the explanation that I read in an interview with Derek Shulman was simply that his voice was not loud enough. If you're a hi-fi nut like me, you might know that microphones need a lot of gain to get up. You start with a microphone signal, and it's a comparable signal to a phonograph pickup. And so it takes a lot of gain. And in order to get his voice loud enough, even amplified, it would simply produce too much feedback, and they just couldn't technically do it. So while he does appear as a vocalist on this, all the songs on which he was lead vocalist kind of had to be scrubbed. And there were a lot of songs of Gentle Giants where there was a combination of Kerry Minier and Derek Shulman. For example, on I Lost My Head, it starts off with a very melodic Carrie Meniere vocal, and then Derek Schulman kicks in when it gets super heavy. And so when they do it live, they had to cut out the Carrie Meniere part of the song. And so it appears here as Peel the Paint, I Lost My Head medley. And whereas Carrie Meniere was so front and center on the Octopus album, here we just get excerpts from Octopus because they could only put in the parts that Derek Schulman sang lead on. I'm kind of surprised that they actually have On Reflection on here but that is they all sing on that one. Yeah, and of course this one starts off with Just the Same. I mean, the track list is truly great. Just the Same, Proclamation, On Reflection, excerpts from Octopus. Funny Ways from Three Friends. The Runaway and Experience from In a Glass House. So Sincere, The Proclamation and So Sincere, both from Power and the Glory. Freehand. And they do Sweet Georgia Brown, Breakdown in Brussels. That's not on an album. Interesting. And then Appeal to Paint, Lost My Head medley. So this one came out in 1977, but from a tour in 1976. And again, this is one of the great prog live albums. And I had some great prog live albums. I had Yes Songs, which was a triple live album. I had Emerson, Lake and Palmer. Welcome back, my friends, to the show that never ends, ladies and gentlemen. Emerson, Lake and Palmer. I had that one. Seconds Out by Genesis. I actually recently made a gift of the Emerson, Lake and Palmer and Genesis live albums to a friend who I sort of want to encourage getting into prog. He's younger than me and wouldn't have heard it the first time around for sure. But I couldn't give this one away, even though it's not even in my light rotation over here. It's in the bin, but this one I just have too much emotional attachment to. It's too good an album. I can't let go of it. Great live album. So arguably that's another great album. I mean, if we count Interview as, say, their seventh great album, and then the live album, that really is kind of 8 great albums in a row. Although most people, will throw in the caveat of, well, we'll just talk about their studio albums. And in this case, Interview, arguably not a great album, but it is arguable. But that's a bunch of at least excellent albums. But unfortunately, then we got this. The Missing Piece. So we have a truly great live album, but then in 1977, they release The Missing Piece. Not a great album. Not even arguably a great album. Only arguably a good album. And it is a good album, but it's marred by some songs that I find rather unfortunate. 2 Weeks in Spain and Bet You Thought We Couldn't Do It. What is it that we thought they couldn't do? I think they thought that we thought that they couldn't do punk or new wave. Because we all knew that they could rock. Because they did. They rocked. But they rocked their own way. But could they rock like the Cars and the Ramones and Blondie? Could they rock like the Sex Pistols? The Clash? I don't think they were trying to rock like the Sex Pistols and the Clash. I think they were trying to rock like the Cars and Blondie. Whoever else, I don't know, I'm forgetting. I mean, what else came out in 1977, prog-wise? I was just looking, briefly through my collection. Prog was, yes, came out with maybe their last great album, Going for the One. And I think Going for the One is a great album, but I'm still kind of warming to it. I've only picked it up recently. And I've only recently picked up this one because my brothers advised me, or my older brother Bob advised me, that their last 3 albums were not very good and not worth owning. Now this one I think is probably worth owning because I think it's their last, we find here the last examples of Gentle Giant at their best. At least their best of the rest of the 70s. Because I think the second side of this album is a pretty solid Gentle Giant side. If the first side had been like the second, I would say that this was arguably a great album. Although I can't pick off any tracks on here that I really like a lot. Although, the first or second time I played this, and I'm like listening to the first side and I'm kind of wincing. And then I flipped it over and I put on the second side and I'm like, well, this is Gentle Giant. Okay. But, this is the beginning of a slide, which I suppose really only was maybe a 2-album serious slide. Because after this one came Giant for a Day, and I don't have that one. I could have bought that one, and I could have bought the last one, Civilian, because I saw those used in Fayetteville, Arkansas. But I didn't buy them because I didn't want to. Because I'd been told that they weren't worth listening to. Now, since then, I've heard that, this one is good. It's spotty, though. And again, I would say the first side is forgettable, and the first side is not actually forgettable, but I want to forget the first side. The second side is solid. But then comes Giant for a Day, which I've heard is truly awful, and I've never listened to it. I've never heard it. And I don't know that I want to hear it, because this album alone kind of makes me sad, in which we see sort of 2 sides of Gentle Giant. One side that's sort of trying to keep up with the times. And I don't know that you could say that they're compromising. I mean, are they still doing their own thing? Let's see. This is recorded in Holland. Now that's different. Paul Northfield is the recording engineer. He was on some of the early stuff. GG Tunes by Shulman, and Munir. A Gentle Giant production. All selections composed by Shulman, Munir. So they're still producing it, but it makes me sad. You could say, okay, they'd done that sound, right? They had kind of crystallized their sound with Power and the Glory, and they had done another solid, great album with Freehand. And then Interview, maybe not as strong, but still an amazing album. Where do they go from there? And the world around them is changing. We've got disco coming in. We've got punk and new wave. You can imagine them like saying, our sales are down. Interview didn't sell nearly as well as Freehand. We got to do something. Otherwise we can't maintain a living doing this. Because they were making a decent living being a rock band. They weren't big stars, they weren't getting rich, but they were making a good living at it, doing what they wanted to do. But I can see with, perhaps sales falling off with Interview, I suspect that the live album Playing the Fool did really well. But I don't know that for sure. But they're probably looking around and they're going, we might need to change up some things. We might need to get with the times. And this is where they start trying to get with the times. And it doesn't come off very well. And maybe it comes off like what they did with Simon Dupree and the Big Sound, with going from blues rock to psychedelic. The difference being that they did psychedelic pretty well, but they didn't do punk/new wave well. And then the slide. And I think I can only imagine that Giant for a Day and Civilian also didn't sell very well. Because what are they doing at that point? They're disappointing their core fans. And they're not getting new ones. You know, it's these albums aren't striking a chord with the next generation of fans. And I would imagine in part sales are falling off because while they've still got some hardcore fans, prog isn't the thing that it had been. You know, prog was something that was very popular in the early 70s, but not so much in 1977 or 76. And so, you know, they're losing the casual prog fan. They're maintaining perhaps a core fan base, including people like my older brother who bought all their albums to the end, but didn't think they were very good. And so, you know, eventually they break up. I've heard Civilian is actually a pretty good album, and I would actually like to check that out. I haven't gotten around to checking that out. Maybe, you know, the way I buy albums is I see them in record stores and I buy them. Like, I found this one in a record store and I bought it. You know, in the last years, I haven't seen Giant for a Day or Civilian. I might get Civilian online because that's been remixed and re-released. Giant for a Day, I don't want to try because I think that would just be too sad for me to hear. Because this is a band that really took a hold of some of my first favorite songs were Gentle Giant songs before I knew it was Gentle Giant. I remember my older brother and my mother at some point asking me what my favorite song was. And I didn't know what song, I mean, I knew what song it was. I would recognize it, but I didn't know the name of it. I didn't know who sang it. And so I remember just trying to describe it. And I said, well, it's that, you know, kind of lousy one, or the one with kind of the lousy singer. Me trying to sort of describe Derek Schulman's rather distinctive tenor style. And I think I was probably describing I Lost My Head. That was probably my favorite song when I was 9. But that was also around the time that I got my first clock radio and started listening to the radio, and then, you know, had different favorite songs like Lido Shuffle by Boz Scaggs, Sir Duke by Stevie Wonder, Hotel California by the Eagles. And it was 1977 when my older brother went off to college, and so I wasn't hearing their music around the house anymore. I wasn't hearing my older brother's music in the house, except maybe in the summers, but they were probably not bringing their music collections back with them home for summer vacation. So, you know, Gentle Giant to me is a band that is at least in part responsible for me loving prog, loving music, but prog in particular. And they came out with so many great albums. You know, it's a shame if your favorite band only came out with a couple of great albums. And I would consider myself very fortunate that, you know, maybe my favorite band of all time, Gentle Giant, came out with so many great albums. But it is still sad that they kind of ended with a whimper rather than a bang. And you can see a band like the Police going, you know, because the Police were really prog, masquerading as a punk band. You can see them hitting Synchronicity and going, you know, we're getting seriously on each other's nerves. We're more popular than we've ever been. Maybe we just call it quits right here. Instead of going in that slide like you saw a lot of at least some of the prog bands of the 70s do. You know, Emerson, Lake and Palmer with their Love Beach. Gentle Giant with their Giant for a Day. Genesis, which, you know, I think people who are into prog look at what became of Genesis and go, well, that's just not even the same thing anymore. I mean, good for them. They sold a lot of records, but it's not what we signed up for. It's not what Genesis fans back in the day signed on to. Yes, just kind of going on hiatus, breaking up, basically. I don't want to end this on a downer. I mean, what have I got? How lucky am I to have one of my favorite bands have produced so many great albums, and for me to have enjoyed them for so many years. Not quite continuously, because, you know, say between 1977 and 1981, I didn't get to hear Gentle Giant. But then, you know, in 81 or 82, when I started buying albums for myself and discovered Gentle Giant again, the sort of joy of finding that music that had been my favorite music a few years earlier, but, you know, a few pretty important years, right? A few years at my age, not a big deal. A few years when you're 14, from 9 to 14, those are some pretty important years, when I just had the radio and didn't like a lot of what was on the radio. At least my favorite music, which was prog, wasn't on the radio. So, yeah, it was an amazing experience, really, to rediscover prog, but Gentle Giant in particular, but also Pink Floyd and Genesis and ELP and the rest, and to carry that enjoyment through to the present day, when I'm still occasionally picking up Gentle Giant albums that I didn't have before, and still one that I would like to check out. So, with that, I will call this good. And thank you for tuning in. Invite you to subscribe. Ask you to thumbs up the video if you did like it. And leave me a comment. If you are a Gentle Giant fan, what's your favorite album? And if you can distill it, you know, what's your first memory of hearing Gentle Giant and appreciating their sound? And I hope you tune in again to another of my videos, which are usually about hi-fi equipment and tube amps and stuff. But I like to occasionally do these ones just about the music, because it's about the music, isn't it? All right. Have a good one, everybody. Until I talk to you again, cheers.